A Navy SEAL, lost in the heart of a Montana blizzard, stood alone on a frozen road, his truck dead, his breath visible in the dark. In his arms, two tiny German shepherd puppies wrapped in a blanket, their lives flickering like the last ember of a dying fire. No one should have been out there that night. But then, headlights cut through the storm, a red pickup slowing down beside him. Behind the wheel, an older veteran with weary eyes rolled down his window and said softly, "Hop in, son. No one survives this cold alone." What followed was more than a rescue. It was the beginning of a miracle that healed two broken men and the lives they carried. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. Snow fell in endless silence over the Montana mountains, a curtain of white that blurred the borders between earth and sky. The forest on either side of the narrow road leaned heavy under the weight of winter, its pines whispering in the wind like tired sentinels. The air was sharp enough to sting the lungs, and the cold bit through layers of fabric and resolve alike. Somewhere in that frozen wilderness, a man walked alone, his breath rising in ghostly clouds against the darkness. Luke Tanner moved slowly, boots crunching through drifts that reached his calves. His truck had died more than a mile back, an old engine that coughed once, sputtered, and then gave up entirely. He had sat in the silence for a while, hoping it might start again. But when the temperature inside dropped to where even his breath felt heavy, he'd stepped out, cradling the only warmth he had left. Two German shepherd puppies, wrapped tightly in a wool blanket against his chest. The pups were barely alive when he'd found them that afternoon, abandoned by the roadside in a wooden crate, their fur stiff with frost. They couldn't have been more than 6 weeks old. The smaller one, a black and tan with soft ears that refused to stand, whimpered occasionally, while the other, slightly larger, with golden streaks down its paws, had gone eerily still. Luke had seen that kind of stillness before. The thin line between surrender and survival. He kept walking, his breath shallow, the weight of the pups pulling at his tired arms. His face, hardened by years of discipline, now bore the quiet desperation of a man who had faced storms far worse than this one, only they hadn't been made of snow. At 38, Luke Tanner still looked like the soldier he once was. Tall, broad-shouldered, his hair trimmed close, dark with faint threads of gray. His eyes, steel blue and distant, carried the kind of exhaustion that didn't come from miles walked, but from memories that refused to die. He had been a Navy SEAL once, the kind who went where others didn't come back from. The war had carved pieces out of him, some visible, some not. Since leaving the service 2 years ago, he had lived quietly, driving from job to job, state to state, never staying long enough for anyone to remember his name. Tonight, he was supposed to be heading north, toward a temporary contract near Kalispell. Instead, he was stranded in a blizzard, the ghosts of his past trailing him as faithfully as his footprints. A gust of wind tore across the road, nearly knocking him sideways. He adjusted the blanket around the pups, muttering under his breath, "Hold on, little ones. Not giving up on me yet." He smiled faintly at the absurdity of talking to dogs in a storm, but the sound of his own voice reminded him he was still alive. Through the curtain of white ahead, a faint light flickered, orange, steady, and moving. His pulse quickened. Headlights. He waved his free arm, stumbling forward, his voice breaking against the wind. "Hey, over here." The red glow grew brighter until a pickup truck emerged from the snowstorm, its engine growling low. It slowed as it neared, tires crunching through the ice before stopping a few feet away. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out into the cold. Thomas Reed was built like the kind of man who had spent his life defying weather and war alike. In his mid-50s, his frame was solid but weary, his movements deliberate, not slow, but careful. His short gray hair peeked from under a dark wool cap, and a thick coat hung heavy over his broad shoulders. A short beard, streaked with silver, framed a face both stern and kind, the kind that could command respect without saying a word. His pale blue eyes, sharp but calm, studied Luke for a moment before he spoke. "You stranded, son?" His voice carried the weight of gravel and years. Luke nodded, stepping closer, so the headlights revealed his face. "Truck gave out back there. Been walking a while." He adjusted the blanket slightly, revealing the two pups. "Found them earlier. Couldn't leave them." Thomas's brow furrowed. "You picked one hell of a night to play hero." He took a step closer, squinting through the snow. "You military?" Luke hesitated, then gave a short nod. "Used to be. Navy SEAL." Thomas's expression softened, a flicker of recognition passing through his eyes. "Used to be," he repeated quietly. "Yeah, I know that feeling." The wind howled between them, carrying fine ice that stung their faces. Thomas glanced at the sky, then back at Luke. "This storm's getting worse. You'll freeze to death out here if you keep walking." Luke adjusted his grip on the puppies. "I just need to find shelter, maybe a gas station." "There's nothing for miles," Thomas cut in, his tone firm but not unkind. "I've got a cabin up ahead, 5 minutes if the road holds. You can wait out the storm there." Luke hesitated. Years of training had taught him to be cautious, even when help appeared kind. But the way Thomas stood, steady, unflinching in the cold, reminded him of men he used to trust with his life. The kind who didn't talk much, because they'd already said everything that mattered once before, in a place that didn't allow second chances. Finally, Luke nodded. "All right, I'd appreciate that." Thomas motioned toward the truck. "Hop in. Keep those pups close to the vent. They'll need the heat more than we do." As Luke climbed into the passenger seat, he caught the faint scent of coffee and motor oil, a strangely comforting mix. The cabin of the truck was warm, the heater humming as the windshield wipers carved slow arcs through the snow. The puppies stirred beneath the blanket, pressing their noses toward the vents. Thomas got in and pulled the door shut. "Name's Thomas Reed," he said, shifting into gear. "Used to be Army, Iraq, back when the sand still meant something." Luke glanced at him, surprised by the openness. "Guess that makes us both survivors of bad decisions," he said quietly. Thomas gave a low chuckle, the kind that came more from memory than humor. "Ain't that the truth?" For a while they drove in silence. The only sounds were the rumble of the engine and the occasional groan of the wind against the windows. The snow outside thickened, but the warmth inside began to thaw the ache from Luke's hands. Thomas finally spoke, his voice quieter now. "That uniform? Been a while since I saw one of those outside a base. You coming from somewhere, or running from it?" Luke stared out the window, watching the snow blur into streaks. "A bit of both," he said. Thomas nodded slowly, as if he understood, without needing to ask more. "Yeah, the road's full of men like that. Ones still walking because they don't know where to stop." Luke didn't reply. but his grip on the blanket tightened. The puppies shifted slightly, their tiny bodies pressing closer to him. After a few more minutes, Thomas turned off the main road, guiding the truck down a narrow path lined with snow-covered trees. A faint yellow glow appeared ahead, flickering through the storm. "That's the cabin," he said. "Roof's solid, and the fire's probably still warm." When they pulled up to the clearing, the snow was falling harder, flakes swirling under the headlights like ghosts. Thomas parked, leaving the engine running for heat. He turned to Luke. "You'll stay tonight. Roads will be gone by morning." Luke opened his mouth to protest, but Thomas's tone left no room for argument. "That's not a request, son. No one survives this kind of cold alone." Luke exhaled slowly, the fight leaving his shoulders. "Thank you," he said simply. They stepped out together into the storm. The red truck lights painted the snow around them in shades of crimson, glowing against the dark trees. Thomas moved to open the cabin door, while Luke stood near the truck, the puppies nestled safely in his arms. Their tiny eyes blinked in the glow of the headlights, two sparks of life against the frozen night. Thomas turned back, his voice carrying softly through the wind. "Come on in before the storm buries us both." Luke followed, his boots crunching through the snow. The wind whipped around them, but for a moment it seemed the world had quieted. In the glow of the truck's taillights, two men, both shaped by battles no one else could see, stood face to face in the heart of winter. Their breath rose in mist, their eyes heavy with weariness and something close to understanding. The snow fell harder, covering the road behind them, erasing where one man's footprints had ended and another's had begun. The red glow flickered once more across their faces, and in that fragile light, the two German Shepherd puppies stirred, their small eyes reflecting what little warmth the world still offered, like a fire refusing to die in the middle of the storm. The storm showed no sign of mercy. Wind howled around the cabin walls, whistling through every crack in the old wood, as though testing its endurance. Snow piled high against the porch, erasing the road they'd come from, until the outside world became nothing but a swirl of white beyond the frosted window panes. Inside, however, a fragile warmth had begun to settle. The fire Thomas had built in the stone hearth hissed softly as it devoured the logs, casting a flickering orange light across the walls lined with old photographs and hunting tools. Luke sat cross-legged on a worn rug, the two puppies bundled in a wool blanket near the fire. The heat was working. Their fur had begun to steam faintly, dampness evaporating in the glow. The smaller pup, black and tan, alert but timid, had stopped trembling and now pressed its nose into Luke's hand. The other, golden-pawed and restless, tried to wriggle free. "Easy there, little one," Luke murmured. "You've got more fight in you than most soldiers I've known." The words carried a half-smile that vanished before it reached his eyes. Thomas watched him from the kitchen corner, where he stood boiling water over an old gas stove. His movements were slow but sure, practiced by years of solitude. The man's back was broad, the curve of his shoulders suggesting both strength and weariness. The faint scars on his knuckles spoke of a life that hadn't been gentle. "Coffee'll be ready in a minute," he said, voice gravelly from disuse. "Ain't much, but it'll keep the chill from chewing your bones." Luke nodded without looking up. "I'll take anything hot," he said, eyes on the puppies. Thomas poured 2 cups and brought them over. The mugs didn't match. One had a chipped rim, the other was a dull, military-issue tin. but the smell of roasted beans filled the room like a memory of civilization. As they drank, silence stretched between them. Not awkward, but cautious, like two men measuring the distance between their ghosts. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, the fire snapped and whispered. Thomas was the first to break it. "You said you were Navy," he began, his tone light but probing. "How long were you in?" 15 years, Luke said, staring into the fire. "Got out 6 months ago." 15, Thomas repeated, letting out a low whistle. "That's a lifetime for some." Luke didn't answer at first. His fingers traced the edge of the mug absently, eyes unfocused. "Feels longer," he finally said. "Last deployment went bad. Lost my partner. My fault, maybe. Maybe not. Doesn't matter much now." Thomas studied him quietly. The younger man's words carried the flat tone of someone used to burying pain beneath discipline. He'd heard it before, in hospitals, in bars, in the mirror. "What was his name?" "Carter Hayes," Luke said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We'd served together since our first tour. He was the kind of guy who could find a joke even when hell was burning. We were supposed to clear a site. Routine, they said. We walked into an ambush instead. He didn't make it out. I did." Luke looked down at his hands, the calluses white against his skin. "They gave me a medal. I left the next week." Thomas's gaze softened. He sat back in the old armchair, the leather creaking beneath his weight. "Medals don't mean much when the man who earned it ain't the one wearing it," he said quietly. Luke looked up, surprised by the accuracy of the words. "You sound like you've been there." Thomas chuckled dryly. "Iraq. 03. Spent years building roads nobody drove on and watching kids grow up faster than we did. Came home, and the world had moved on without me." His eyes drifted to the mantel, where a single framed photograph sat. A woman with auburn hair and kind, tired eyes, smiling in the sunlight. "My wife, Sarah," he said softly, when he caught Luke looking. "Lost her to cancer 8 years ago. Doctors said early, but they were late. By the time we knew, she was gone. I stayed here after that. Figured I'd had enough of noise." The confession hung between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. Luke nodded slowly. "I'm sorry," he said, meaning it. Thomas waved a hand. "Don't be. Life takes what it wants. All you can do is keep the fire lit." The smaller puppy yawned, stretching tiny paws toward the flames. Thomas chuckled softly. "Guess I'm not the only one needs warming up tonight. You name 'em yet?" Luke shook his head. "Not yet. Wasn't sure they'd make it this far." "Well," Thomas said, leaning forward, "the brave one looks like a scout to me. Always charging ahead before thinking." He pointed to the golden-pawed pup, now attempting to climb over Luke's leg. "And that quiet one, he's got eyes like an echo, staring deep but soft. Call him Echo." Luke smiled. A real one this time. "Scout and Echo," he repeated. "Yeah, that fits." The names seemed to settle something in the air. The cabin, once haunted by the wind's lament, now carried the sounds of small paws tapping against the wood floor, and the occasional bark so faint it could have been a dream. Thomas laughed softly when Scout tugged at his bootlace, a sound that startled even him. "Well, would you look at that?" he said, shaking his head. "Haven't laughed like that in years." Luke watched him, realizing how rare that warmth must be. "Guess they're good for both of us," he said. The hours passed slowly. They ate simple food, canned stew heated over the fire, and shared bits of stories neither had told in a long time. Thomas spoke about his years as a mechanic after retiring, fixing up old trucks for the few ranchers still hanging on in the valley. He mentioned his neighbor, Martha Jennings, an older woman who sometimes dropped by to bring pie or gossip, though he always pretended to be too busy to listen. Truth is, he admitted, she keeps me human. Luke found himself talking more than he expected about how he'd drifted from place to place since leaving the service, trying to find somewhere that didn't echo with orders. "You ever find it?" Thomas asked. Luke stared into the fire, the reflection dancing in his eyes. "Not yet," he said, "but I keep walking." The storm grew wilder as night deepened. Wind slammed against the walls, and the old cabin groaned but held firm. Thomas tossed another log into the fire, sparks flaring briefly before fading into embers. "You'll stay the night," he said firmly. "Storm's only getting meaner." Luke nodded. "I wasn't planning on arguing." Thomas gave a small grin. "Good. My wife used to say, I don't lose arguments. I just outlast people." The firelight flickered across their faces, the old soldier and the younger one, both bearing scars too deep for the cold to reach. Echo and Scout had curled up together on the rug, their small chests rising and falling in tandem, twin rhythms of fragile life. Outside, the wind howled, shaking the window panes. Inside, the fire burned steady, wrapping the two men in its glow. Thomas leaned back in his chair, his voice low but certain. "You know, Luke," he said, eyes on the flames, "sometimes God sends lost souls to our door, just to remind us the road home's still there." Luke didn't reply, but his gaze softened. The puppies stirred slightly, their tiny paws twitching in dreams. For the first time in months, he felt a strange peace, not the kind earned by silence, but by shared company in a night that should have broken both of them. The dawn came slowly, like a secret the forest wasn't ready to share. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world wrapped in silver silence. Snow draped every branch, every roof, every inch of the clearing outside the cabin, soft as ash. The sky was a pale gray, brightening to white near the horizon. The world seemed reborn and fragile, untouched, but alive. Luke Tanner stood by the window, his breath fogging the glass as he stared out at the buried shape of his truck. Only the faint curve of its roof and side mirrors showed above the snowdrift. "Guess I'm not driving anywhere soon," he muttered. Behind him, Thomas was at the stove, frying bacon and pouring coffee. The scent of it filled the small cabin, blending with the faint smoke from the fire that still crackled low in the hearth. The older man moved with the ease of routine, a quiet rhythm that came from years of solitary mornings. He looked over his shoulder, the corners of his mouth twitching upward. "You're welcome to dig that thing out if you're feeling ambitious," he said, "but I'd wait till spring." Luke chuckled softly. "Might take that advice." He turned back to the fire, where Echo and Scout were curled up together on a folded blanket. Their fur was fluffy now, dry and soft, and the pups' eyes followed every movement in the room with curious energy. When Thomas set 2 plates on the table, Scout immediately yipped, tail thumping against the wood floor. "They think everything that smells good belongs to them," Thomas said with a grin. Luke sat down, the heat from the coffee seeping into his cold fingers. He hadn't realized how hungry he was until now. They ate mostly in silence, save for the occasional clatter of forks and the crackle of the fire. Outside, the snow reflected so much light it seemed to spill through the windows. It was the kind of morning that made the world feel clean again. After breakfast, Thomas pulled on his thick coat and handed Luke an extra pair of gloves. "You're not getting out of earning your keep, Seal," he said. "Storm left a mess out there. The shed roof's near gone, and the path to the barn's buried." Luke smirked, slipping on the gloves. "Yes, sir." They spent the morning working side by side in the yard, breaking the silence only with the rhythmic chop of an axe or the grunt of effort. The cold bit at their faces, but both men moved with quiet determination. Thomas swung the axe with the measured strength of experience, splitting logs clean in two. Luke stacked them neatly, his movements sharp and efficient. It felt good, simple, purposeful. Every strike, every lift, every breath seemed to thaw something frozen inside him. Occasionally, the dogs darted through the snow, their tiny bodies half vanishing in the drifts. Echo was cautious, circling near Luke's boots, while Scout leapt through the snow with reckless joy, barking at every falling clump from the trees. Their energy made Thomas laugh aloud more than once. "That one's got your stubborn streak," he said, nodding toward Scout. "Figures," Luke said. "The loud one's always the survivor." By noon, the sun broke through the clouds, and the snow on the roof glittered like shards of glass. Thomas leaned on his shovel, breathing heavily, his face flushed pink from the cold. "That's enough for now," he said. "Let's check the barn before it decides to collapse on my tools." The barn was old but sturdy, built decades earlier by Thomas's father, who had been a carpenter before the war took him. Inside, the air smelled of hay and old wood. Luke followed Thomas through the dim light, brushing snow from his shoulders. They cleared the doorway, repaired a loose board, and swept the floor. When Luke looked up at the rafters, he noticed a few shingles missing where the wind had torn them free. "I can fix that," he said, already dragging over a ladder. Thomas frowned. "You don't have to." "I know," Luke interrupted gently, "but I want to." From above, he could see the clearing stretch in every direction. Snow-covered pines, the glint of sunlight on the frozen stream, and the cabin below, small but alive. He hammered the last nail in place, then climbed down, dusting his hands. "Good as new," he said. Thomas nodded, impressed. "You work like a man who's done this before." Luke shrugged. "You'd be surprised what you learn fixing roofs in far worse places." They both laughed quietly. The air inside the barn felt lighter somehow. Later that afternoon, they moved on to the storage shed beside the barn. Thomas opened the door, revealing stacks of old crates, rusted tools, and forgotten boxes. "Most of this junk belonged to my father," he said. "I keep telling myself I'll sort it out one day." Luke knelt beside a stack of weathered boxes, brushing away the dust. "Mind if I help?" "Be my guest. Just don't fall through the floor. Half the boards in here are older than me." They worked for an hour, sorting tools, setting aside things that could still be used. Echo and Scout explored every corner, their noses twitching, tails wagging through clouds of dust. Then Luke opened one box that seemed newer than the rest, a small wooden crate sealed with yellowed tape. Inside, wrapped in cloth, lay a framed photograph. He froze. The picture showed two men in uniform standing in front of a Humvee, both younger, both smiling in the blinding sun of a desert. One of them was unmistakably Thomas, clean-shaven, eyes brighter, shoulders straighter. The other man was someone Luke knew instantly, even though he hadn't seen that face in over a decade. His brother, Evan Tanner. Luke's breath caught. "Where did you get this?" he asked quietly. Thomas turned, startled by the tone. When he saw the photo in Luke's hands, his face went pale. For a moment, The only sound was the wind slipping through the cracks in the boards. "You know him," Thomas said finally. "He's my brother," Luke said, his voice low. "Evan Tanner. He went missing near Mosul 10 years ago. We never found a body, only reports, no closure." His grip on the frame tightened. "He served under you, didn't he?" Thomas's jaw clenched. His eyes darted to the ground, the lines in his face deepening. "Yeah," he said at last. "He did." Luke's heartbeat thundered in his ears. "What happened?" Thomas took a long breath, his hands trembling slightly. "That's not a story I've told in a long time," he said, "and maybe not one you want to hear." Luke stepped closer. "Try me." But Thomas didn't answer. Instead, he reached out and carefully took the photograph back, his eyes lingering on it as though the younger version of himself might still speak from within the frame. "Some ghosts don't rest easy," he said quietly. "And some truths don't belong to just one man." Luke stood there, caught between anger and confusion, the sound of the wind rising again outside. Echo whined softly near his feet, and Scout nudged Thomas's boot, sensing the sudden heaviness in the air. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The light through the small window dimmed, the silver day fading toward the gray of evening. Thomas finally looked up, his voice breaking the silence like the first crack in ice. "I think," he said, eyes distant, "the Lord has a strange sense of timing. I buried that photograph a long time ago. Never thought it would find its way home." The quiet that followed felt too big for the room. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft, slow, as if the sky itself had stopped to listen. Inside the cabin, a secret long buried had risen to the surface, and in its shadow, both men knew the peace of the morning had gone. The fire had burned low when Thomas finally spoke. The air in the cabin felt thick, heavy with something unspoken. Outside, the snow pressed against the windows, soft but relentless. Luke sat at the table, the photograph still lying between them. The faces in it, his brother Evan's and Thomas's younger self, seemed frozen in time, untouched by the storm that now roared beyond the walls. "You owe me the truth," Luke said at last, his voice flat but trembling. Thomas's weathered hands clenched the edge of the table. His eyes, usually calm, flickered with something closer to pain. "You're right," he said quietly. "You deserve to hear it." He leaned back, exhaling. "It was Mosul, 10 years ago. Evan Tanner was under my command. We were assigned to secure an old industrial zone, routine op, or so they told us. But nothing about that day was routine." Thomas's voice was low, steady, but each word seemed carved out of regret. "We were ambushed, dozens of them, hidden in the ruins. I remember the sound first, metal scraping on concrete, then the crack of rifles. We lost 3 men in seconds. Evan, your brother, he was the youngest on the team. Smart, sharp as hell. He could have stayed back with the comms, but he volunteered to cover our retreat." Luke's jaw tightened. "He stayed behind?" Thomas nodded slowly. "He pulled me out when the blast hit. I caught the edge of it, lost consciousness for a minute. When I came to, the building was collapsing. He was still inside." He paused, staring into the fire. "I tried to go back. Swear to you, I did. But the floor caved in before I could reach him." The flames reflected in Thomas's eyes as he spoke, making them look almost wet. "I radioed for extraction, but by the time backup came, the place was gone. They said no one could have survived, but I never believed he just vanished. Sometimes in dreams, I still hear him shouting my name." Luke's fingers brushed the edge of the photograph, The image blurred slightly under his touch. And you never told anyone? Thomas shook his head. They didn't ask. The report said, mission failure. I carried that weight home, buried it under work, under silence. Then Sarah got sick, and I stopped trying to make sense of what life wanted from me. His voice broke slightly when he said her name. After she passed, I came here. Figured the world had taken enough from me, and maybe it was time to stop pretending I had anything left to give. Luke stood abruptly, the chair legs scraping against the wooden floor. He paced to the window, staring at the darkness outside. The reflection of the fire flickered faintly in the glass beside his face. You lived, he said quietly, because he didn't. Thomas didn't answer. There was nothing he could say that would make it right. Luke turned, his face pale and hard. My mother waited years for a call that never came. I told her he was probably still out there, maybe a prisoner, maybe lost. I told her to keep hoping. His voice cracked. You could have told us what happened. Thomas's shoulders sagged, as if the weight of the past had finally crushed the breath from him. I couldn't face her, he said. I couldn't face anyone. The kind of guilt that doesn't end. It eats you slow. Silence stretched again, broken only by the occasional crackle of the fire. Then Luke turned away, moving toward the door. Echo and Scout lifted their heads, their eyes following him. Where are you going? Thomas asked. Out, Luke said simply, pulling on his coat. Need air. Thomas started to stand, but Luke shook his head. Don't. He picked up the puppies gently, wrapping them in a blanket, and stepped into the storm. The door shut behind him, and the wind swallowed the sound of his footsteps almost immediately. Thomas stood still for a long time, staring at the empty doorway. The fire popped once, sending a spray of sparks into the air, then settled into embers. He rubbed his face with both hands. The silence that followed was unbearable. He grabbed his oil lamp from the counter and lit it with shaking hands. The glow was weak, trembling like his breath. Pulling on his heavy coat, he stepped out into the night. The cold hit him like a blow. The wind had softened, but the snow still fell thick, glittering under the lantern light. The forest loomed ahead, quiet and endless. Luke, he called, his voice echoing through the trees. Nothing answered but the wind. He tried again. Luke! Then softer, as if to no one. Evan! He trudged forward, boots sinking deep into the drifts. Each step was harder than the last, but he kept going, following faint tracks that disappeared into the woods. His mind drifted, images of Mosul flashing behind his eyes, the smell of smoke, the ringing in his ears, the sound of Evan shouting through chaos. And then silence. He stumbled once, catching himself on a snow-covered branch. The lantern wavered, nearly dying. You saved my life, he murmured into the wind, and I've been running from that ever since. After what felt like an hour, he saw movement ahead, a faint shape under a pine tree. He raised the lamp higher, and the light found Luke, sitting on a fallen log, snow gathered on his shoulders. The puppies were in his arms, their fur frosted with ice. Thomas approached slowly. You'll freeze out here, he said. Luke didn't look up at first. His voice was steady, but hollow. He looked like you, he said. In the photo. Younger, but same eyes. I used to think if I ever found the man who was there with him that day, I'd hate him. But now, I don't know what to feel. Thomas stopped a few feet away, the lantern's light flickering between them. I've hated myself enough for both of us, he said softly. If that means anything. Luke finally looked up. The anger in his face had faded, replaced by something quieter, harder to name. "Maybe that's the problem," he said. "You've been punishing yourself so long, you forgot how to live." Thomas's breath clouded in the cold. He nodded slowly. "And maybe you've been running so long, you forgot what home feels like." They stood there for a moment, the wind whispering through the trees. Scout whimpered softly in Luke's arms. Echo licked his chin, as if reminding him of warmth. Thomas reached out a gloved hand. "Come on, son," he said. "Let's get them inside. Fire's still burning." Luke hesitated, then nodded. Together, they turned back toward the cabin, their shadows long against the snow. The lamplight swung between them, glowing faintly in the storm. When they reached the porch, Thomas paused, glancing at the two small shapes in Luke's arms. "You know," he said quietly, "sometimes surviving ain't about being strong. It's about remembering who didn't." Luke met his gaze. "Then maybe that's what we're both doing," he said, "trying to live for him." Inside, the fire greeted them with a soft, crackling warmth. They didn't speak again that night. Thomas fed the fire, Luke dried the pups, and the cabin filled once more with the quiet rhythm of survival. Two men, both haunted, both still learning what forgiveness meant, not as a gift, but as a burden shared. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, the silence between them no longer felt empty. The next morning dawned softer than any before it. The snow had begun to melt, leaving the pines dripping with silver tears that glimmered in the weak sunlight. Mist curled above the frozen stream near the cabin, and the air carried that damp, earthy scent that comes after a storm finally surrenders. Luke stood outside, hands in his pockets, watching Scout and Echo tumble through the half-melted snow, chasing each other clumsily across the clearing. Their playful barks echoed against the quiet forest, bringing a faint smile to his face. Behind him, the door creaked open. Thomas stepped out, pulling on a heavy flannel jacket over his sweater. The man's posture was still solid, but there was a gentler ease to his movements now. "Roads will be passable by noon," he said, squinting toward the narrow dirt trail that wound down the hill. "We'll head to Cold Creek for supplies. Could use a new radio, and I reckon your truck needs a few parts before it's more than just a snow sculpture." Luke nodded. "Sounds good. I'll cover the fuel, if they've got any left in that town." Thomas grunted, amused. Cold Creek's the kind of place where folks still trade favors before dollars. Keep your politeness sharp and your wallet closed. By midday, they had loaded Thomas's old red pickup with empty fuel cans and a few lists scribbled on torn paper. Scout and Echo rode in the back seat, their noses pressed to the frosted glass, leaving small clouds of breath on it. The road wound down through the forest, the snow thinning as they descended. Luke watched the trees blur past, lost in thought. Cold Creek was small, barely more than a main street lined with wooden storefronts and old signs bleached by years of sun and snow. The American flag in front of the post office fluttered weakly in the cold wind. A few townspeople looked up as the red truck rolled in, their expressions a mix of curiosity and wariness. In a place this quiet, strangers were a kind of weather. They came rarely, and everyone noticed. Thomas parked in front of a hardware store whose sign read, "Keller's Supply and Fix-It." As Luke stepped out, he could feel eyes on him. A group of old men, sitting outside the barber shop, paused their conversation, their gazes shifting between his uniform-like jacket and the two dogs wagging excitedly at his boots. Friendly crowd? Luke muttered. Thomas smirked. Don't take it personal. Last time this town saw new faces, they were census takers and taxmen. Inside the hardware store, the air smelled of oil and sawdust. A man in his 70s stood behind the counter, his suspenders stretched tight over a plaid shirt, his gray hair sticking out in unruly tufts. "Morning, Tom," he said, his tone carrying both surprise and warmth. "Didn't think you'd drive down this soon after the storm." "Couldn't let the snow trap us forever, Hank," Thomas replied, clapping him on the shoulder. "Need some plugs, a belt, for the generator, and maybe that old tire jack if you haven't sold it yet." Hank Keller glanced at Luke, his sharp eyes narrowing slightly. "New friend?" "Luke Tanner," Thomas said quickly. "Passing through. Truck broke down up near my ridge." Hank nodded slowly. "Good to meet you, son. Always room for another hard worker around here. Just steer clear of Sheriff Rudd. He's got an eye for strangers." He chuckled as he went to fetch the parts. When they stepped back onto the street, the smell of coffee drifted through the air. Across the road, a small sign swung gently in the wind. Martha's Cafe. Warm meals, honest prices. Thomas's expression softened. "Haven't been in there for a long while," he murmured. Luke followed his gaze. "Old friend?" "Something like that," Thomas said, then sighed. "Come on. She makes the best pie this side of the Rockies." The bell above the cafe door jingled softly as they entered. The place was small, but cozy, filled with the low hum of a radio and the scent of cinnamon and roasted beans. Behind the counter stood a woman in her early 60s, tall and graceful despite her age, with silver-streaked auburn hair tied in a loose bun. Her skin was fair, her features gentle but alert, and her eyes, the color of lake water under sunlight, carried both kindness and the weight of loss. When she saw Thomas, her face lit with a mixture of surprise and emotion. "Well, I'll be damned," she said, setting down the coffee pot. "Thomas Reed. I thought the forest had swallowed you whole." Thomas smiled faintly. "Would have, if not for a younger man and 2 noisy dogs." She laughed, the sound soft but genuine. "Still rescuing people, I see." She poured coffee into 2 mugs and gestured to a booth near the window. "Sit. You both look like you've been living on frostbite and regrets." Luke smiled despite himself as he slid into the booth. The warmth of the cafe seeped into his bones. Martha Jenkins moved with calm efficiency, bringing them pie and refilling their cups without asking. There was a quiet grace to her, someone who had learned to carry sorrow without letting it harden her heart. When she finally sat with them, she studied Luke curiously. "You've got the look of a soldier," she said. "Eyes that see too much and still look for something to fix." Luke chuckled softly. "Retired SEAL. Guess the look doesn't wash off easy." Her gaze softened. "No, it doesn't. My husband was the same way." She turned to Thomas. "You remember Paul Jenkins, don't you?" Thomas nodded slowly. "Hard to forget. He saved half our convoy that day outside Basra. And you—" He hesitated, voice lowering. "You sent letters to all of us afterward. Still have mine." Martha smiled wistfully. "He always spoke highly of you, Thomas. Said you were the kind of man who carried others on your back if the world fell apart." Her eyes glistened briefly before she blinked it away. "He's gone now. Hart gave out 3 winters ago. I keep this place running for something to do. And because men like you still need somewhere warm to sit." For a moment, the only sound was the soft scrape of forks on plates. Then Martha reached under the counter and unfolded a faded map. You said your truck's up by the ridge, right? Thomas nodded. There used to be a training camp not far from there, she said, tracing her finger across the creases. Old K-9 program, military dogs, handlers, the works. My nephew used to deliver supplies there, abandoned years ago, but maybe you'll find spare gear, fuel, or even tools. It's marked right here. She circled a spot deep in the woods. Call it a hunch, but I think you'll find something you didn't know you were looking for. Thomas looked at her with quiet gratitude. You've still got that strange way of knowing things before they happen. Martha laughed softly. Comes with age and heartbreak. They finished their meal and thanked her. She pressed a thermos of hot coffee into Luke's hands before they left. For the road, she said, and tell those dogs they're welcome any time. Echo wagged his tail at her voice, as if understanding. As they drove back toward the mountains, the town faded into the snowy haze behind them. Luke unfolded the map on his lap, tracing the red circle Martha had drawn. This training camp, my brother might have been there, he said quietly. Thomas kept his eyes on the road. Then we'll go see, he said simply. Maybe it's time both of us stopped running from the past. The truck climbed steadily into the mist, the sound of its engine mingling with the faint rustle of wind through melting branches, like a promise that something long buried was waiting to be found. The next morning dawned clear and cold, a sky of washed-out blue stretching endlessly above the white ridges. The red truck rumbled along a half-forgotten service road, tires crunching over frozen gravel. Luke sat quietly in the passenger seat, the worn map from Martha Jenkins folded on his lap. Scout and Echo were nestled in a blanket behind them, their small heads peeking over the seat as the forest passed by in streaks of pine and frost. The route was rough, the trail narrowing until even the trees seemed to lean closer, as though guarding whatever secret waited ahead. Thomas kept one hand steady on the wheel, his eyes fixed on the path. His weathered face caught the light in flashes, creased lines, gray stubble, and eyes that looked like they'd stared into both sandstorms and snow squalls without flinching. We should be close, he said. Old Echo Base sat between two ridges. Army shut it down after the last handler retired. Some said they left it to rot. Luke glanced out the window. Funny name, he said. Echo Base. Thomas smiled faintly. Every unit that trained there said the same thing. They claimed you could hear the dogs barking long after they were gone. The road ended at a pair of rusted iron gates, one half fallen off its hinges. Above them hung a weathered sign, its paint barely visible beneath years of snow and rust. U.S. Army K-9 Training Division, Cold Creek Detachment. A torn American flag clung stubbornly to its pole, frayed but still recognizable. The silence around it was vast. They climbed out of the truck. The air was sharp and thin, filled with the creak of branches shifting under melting ice. Scout bounded forward immediately, nose to the ground, tail wagging. Echo followed more carefully, sniffing the snow, his ears pricked. Luke ran his hand over the gate, feeling the cold bite of the iron. Feels strange, he murmured, like stepping back into someone else's memory. Thomas nodded. Maybe it's both of ours. The base stretched across a wide clearing, a handful of long, low buildings sagging under years of neglect. The kennels stood empty, their chain-link fences twisted by time, while the barracks' windows were broken or fogged with frost. Still, there was something hauntingly familiar about the place, the order of its layout, the faint scent of oil and hay, and the ghost of discipline that never quite left military ground. Luke walked slowly through the yard, boots crunching against the crust of snow. He knelt by one of the kennels, brushing away frost from a nameplate. The letters were almost erased but still legible. Unit 4, Handler Sergeant E. Tanner. His breath caught. For a long moment, he just stared. "This was his," he whispered. Thomas joined him, his expression solemn. "Your brother trained dogs here before he deployed," he said quietly. "I remember the reports. Said he worked with one of the best canines they ever bred. Name was Valor." Luke's hand froze midair. The name struck like a heartbeat through the cold. He stood, scanning the field. "Valor," he repeated, almost to himself. "I used to see photos of him when I was a kid. Big German shepherd, black and tan. Evan called him his shadow." Scout barked suddenly, digging excitedly near the old flagpole. Echo joined in, pawing the snow with determined little scrapes. Luke hurried over. The pups had uncovered something metallic, a faint glint beneath the ice. He brushed away the frost carefully. It was a dog tag, a collar plate, tarnished and bent but still readable. The engraved letters were faint but unmistakable. Valor. Luke's breath left him in a cloud of white. He turned it over in his hand, his gloved thumb tracing the letters. "He was here," he said softly. "They must have left everything behind after the shutdown." Thomas crouched beside him, his gaze fixed on the collar. "Funny how things find their way back to those who need them," he murmured. For a while, neither man spoke. The wind moved through the trees, whistling softly against the corrugated roofs. Then Thomas stood, brushing the snow from his coat. "You know," he said slowly, "this place isn't as dead as it looks. A few boards, some paint, and it could stand again. Maybe even serve a purpose." Luke glanced up. "What purpose?" Thomas looked toward the kennels. "You said you've been drifting since you left the service. Me, I've been hiding from the world. Maybe this is where both things stop. We could rebuild this place, turn it into a shelter. For dogs that got left behind, for men like us who don't know where else to go." Luke studied him for a long moment. The idea hung in the cold air like a fragile spark. He looked down at the collar again, then at Scout and Echo, tails wagging by his boots. "You think we could really do that?" Thomas smiled faintly, the first real one Luke had seen from him. "We built worse things into something good once. This time, maybe we build for the living." Luke nodded slowly. "If the past can't stay buried," he said, "at least we can make it grow into something worth remembering." They spent the afternoon exploring what remained of the base. Thomas pried open the supply shed, uncovering old shovels, coils of wire, and a forgotten generator. Luke cleared snow from the kennels, hammering loose nails back into place. The work warmed them, drove away the ghosts. Scout and Echo followed them everywhere, darting through shadows and light. At one point, Luke caught them staring at the horizon, ears perked, as if listening to something distant and unseen. "Maybe they hear what we can't," he said. "Echo Base," Thomas murmured, looking around. "Guess the name still fits." As the light began to fade, they gathered near the center of the yard where the flagpole leaned crookedly. Thomas found a length of rope in the shed, and together they straightened the pole, packing snow and stone around its base to keep it upright. The flag, though faded, still bore its stars and stripes. Luke tied it carefully, his gloved hands steady. When they raised it, the cloth fluttered weakly at first, then caught the wind and unfurled fully. Its edges shimmered with dying sunlight, casting long shadows across the snow. The sound of it flapping against the cold air was soft but strong, like a heartbeat returning after years of silence. They stood side by side, watching the flag ripple. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was something else now, something alive. Thomas turned to Luke, his voice low. "You hear that?" Luke frowned. "The wind?" "No," Thomas said. "Listen closer." Through the whisper of pines and the creak of snow, there was indeed another sound. Faint, rhythmic, like breathing carried on the wind. The forest exhaled around them, steady and calm. Luke smiled faintly. "Maybe the place is glad to have company again." "Maybe," Thomas said, eyes on the horizon. "Or maybe it's just the ghosts, resting easy." The flag snapped once in the wind, proud and defiant. Echo and Scout sat side by side beneath it, their eyes gleaming amber in the fading light. The two men looked at the kennels, the empty barracks, the rising moon above the pines. The snow crunched softly beneath their boots as they turned back toward the cabin. Behind them, Echo Base stood tall again, its rusted gate whispering in the wind, a promise reborn. By late afternoon, clouds had gathered once more above the valley, a gray veil settling over the mountains. Luke and Thomas had spent the day repairing a section of the roof at the old K9 base, their breath visible in the cooling air. Echo and Scout darted across the yard, chasing each other through patches of melted snow. The place had begun to breathe again. Each sound, each movement, a small proof of life returning to forgotten ground. Thomas stood near the flagpole, looking toward the horizon. "Storm's building again," he muttered. "Smells like snow." Luke nodded, wiping his hands on his jacket. "Let it come. This place could use a clean start." He smiled faintly, then knelt to scratch behind Scout's ears. The little dog yipped happily. They didn't hear the truck until it was almost at the gate. A low, rattling growl of an old engine echoing through the trees. Thomas turned sharply. A dark green pickup emerged from the tree line, its headlights off, moving with a reckless sway. When it stopped, 4 men jumped out, their boots crunching over the ice. They were hunters. Thomas recognized the type instantly. All of them wore mismatched camouflage and beer-heavy grins. The tallest one, broad-shouldered and red-faced, carried a rifle slung carelessly over his arm. His name was Earl Denson, known in Cold Creek as a man who drank harder than he worked. His eyes were bloodshot, his beard patchy, and his laugh sharp enough to cut glass. "Well, I'll be damned," Earl said, looking around the base. "Didn't think anyone still lived up here. We thought this was government scrap." He kicked at a loose board with his boot. "Heard there were coyotes nesting in these old kennels. Figured we'd flush 'em out." Thomas's voice was steady, but firm. "Ain't no coyotes here, Earl. Just us. You can turn that truck around." Earl grinned, his teeth yellowed. "Relax, old man. We're just having a little fun." He looked at Luke, narrowing his eyes. "Who's your buddy? Looks military. Don't tell me you brought the army back to Cold Creek." Luke said nothing, but the steel in his gaze made Earl pause for half a second before laughing again. His companions, 3 younger men, faces half hidden by beanies, snickered nervously. One of them, a lanky man with pale hair named Roy, carried a half-empty bottle of whiskey and smelled of gasoline. Thomas stepped forward. "You're drunk. Get back in the truck before someone gets hurt." Earl's smile twisted. "Ain't nobody telling me what to do on my mountain." He gestured toward the nearest kennel. "See? Empty. Told you. Whole damn place ought to burn. It's cursed ground anyway. Luke's muscles tensed. Put the lighter down, he said quietly. But Roy had already flicked it open, the small flame dancing in the cold air. Bet this old wood goes up fast, he slurred. Before anyone could move, he tossed it toward a pile of dry hay near the kennels. The fire caught instantly, a hiss and roar exploding into the air. "Damn it!" Thomas shouted, lunging forward. He grabbed a bucket from the ground, throwing snow over the flames, but the wind turned against him. Within seconds, the fire spread along the outer wall, feeding on years of dry timber and oil stains. "Earl!" Thomas barked. "Get your men out!" But Earl stumbled backward, eyes wide with the sudden reality of what they'd done. I didn't mean—" His words drowned beneath the crackling roar as smoke thickened. The flames climbed the side of the barracks, turning the old wood into a furnace. Luke ran toward the sound of barking. Echo and Scout were trapped near the main building. He pulled his jacket over his face and charged through the haze, kicking open a door half-hinged by rust. Inside, the heat was suffocating. The walls glowed orange. Scout barked frantically from beneath a fallen beam. Luke dropped to his knees, pushing the burning timber aside with his gloved hands. His sleeve caught a spark, but he ignored it, grabbing the two pups and tucking them under his coat. "Got you," he gasped. Outside, Thomas was shouting orders like a man back in command. "Water lines frozen. Use snow. Anything wet." From down the valley came the distant wail of a siren. Martha Jenkins had seen the smoke rising from Cold Creek and called the sheriff. By the time her cafe's old delivery truck arrived, she had gathered half the town. Hank Keller, Sheriff Rudd, and a handful of locals who'd followed her through the icy road. Martha climbed out first, her gray hair whipping in the wind. "Thomas!" she shouted, grabbing a bucket from the truck bed. "Tell me where to start." "Barracks first," Thomas yelled back. "Luke's inside." The townsfolk didn't hesitate. They formed a line, passing buckets of snow and water, throwing them onto the flames. Sheriff Rudd, broad-chested, mid-50s, a man more used to breaking up bar fights than battling infernos, took charge of the other side, shouting directions with gruff authority. Martha's hands were raw from the cold, but she kept working, her face streaked with soot. She glanced toward the firelight and saw Luke emerge from the smoke, coughing, two small shapes clutched to his chest. "He's got them," she cried. Luke stumbled toward her, collapsing to one knee as Scout and Echo wriggled free, tails wagging weakly. Martha knelt beside him, her breath shaking. "You're mad, boy," she whispered, half laughing, half crying. Thomas appeared a moment later, his coat singed, his beard streaked with ash. "Good work, son," he said, gripping Luke's shoulder before turning back to the blaze. Together, they joined the bucket line, refusing to step back, even as the wind shifted again, blowing sparks like fiery snowflakes around them. The fight dragged on for what felt like hours. When the fire finally began to die, the sun had long since vanished behind the mountains. The sky turned indigo, then black, and the first snowflakes began to fall, hissing softly as they met the smoldering remains of wood and ash. The barracks were gone, reduced to blackened beams. The kennels stood half-burnt, but the flagpole remained upright, the tattered flag still clinging to its rope. Earl Denson and his men stood by their truck, silent, faces pale with shock. Sheriff Rudd cuffed Roy without ceremony and shoved him toward the cruiser. "You're lucky no one died," he growled. "You'll sober up in a cell." Thomas leaned against what was left of the fence, his breath steadying. Martha handed him a thermos of coffee, her hands trembling slightly. "You always did have a way of finding trouble," she said softly. He smiled wearily. "This time, trouble found me." Luke approached, his face smeared with soot, eyes shining in the faint light. The puppies lay bundled in a blanket near the truck, exhausted but safe. He looked at the charred remains of the base, then at Thomas. "We'll rebuild," he said quietly. Thomas nodded, his gaze steady on the rising snow. "Yeah," he said, "but not just the base." Luke frowned. "What do you mean?" Thomas exhaled slowly. "We saved more than walls tonight. We saved faith. Ours and theirs." He gestured toward the townsfolk still milling about, their breath misting in the air, the sound of quiet relief spreading among them. Been a long time since this valley stood together for anything. Luke looked around. The tired faces, the shared smiles, the snow falling softly over ash and flame. "Then maybe," he said, "we just gave it something to believe in again." Thomas nodded once. The snow thickened, coating the burned ground in a thin layer of white, as if the world itself had chosen to forgive. A year passed, and the valley changed with the seasons. Where black ash had once covered the ground, green grass now pushed through, soft and defiant. The old K9 base, once silent, broken, and burned, stood alive again, rebuilt board by board. A new sign hung proudly at the front gate, carved by Thomas's own hands and painted in bold, clean letters. "Echo Shelter, for dogs and soldiers who've lost their way." The snowmelt from the mountains ran clear through the streams that bordered the property. The air smelled of pine and earth instead of smoke. Inside the wide fenced yard, a dozen dogs barked and played, their collars glinting in the morning sun. Scout and Echo, now grown and strong, ran among them like sentinels, leading the younger dogs through the open field. Luke Tanner stood by the porch, his uniform jacket replaced by a simple flannel shirt and worn jeans. His hair was longer now, and though his eyes still held traces of the man who'd once wandered lost through snow, there was a peace in them that hadn't been there before. He tossed a stick across the yard. Echo sprinted after it, muscles rippling beneath his tan and black coat, while Scout barked in playful protest before joining the chase. Thomas Reed stepped out from the office beside the barn, carrying a clipboard and 2 mugs of coffee. His beard was grayer now, but his shoulders remained as solid as the day Luke first met him. He wore a heavy work jacket with the shelter's logo stitched on the sleeve, Echo and Scout's silhouettes under a rising sun. "You've trained those 2 well," Thomas said, handing Luke a mug. "They're faster than most men I knew in the Army." Luke grinned. They just needed a reason to run. Beyond the kennels, the volunteers were starting their morning routines. One of them, a young woman named Elena Myers, knelt near the fence, her auburn ponytail swinging as she poured kibble into metal bowls. Elena was 27, tall and athletic, her freckled skin tanned by long hours outdoors. She was a veterinary nurse from Billings who'd left city life behind to join the shelter 6 months ago. Her laugh was quick and bright, the kind that filled quiet places like sunlight. "Elena's got the new ones eating from her hand," Thomas said, nodding toward her. "Literally." Luke watched as she coaxed a nervous shepherd mix to eat. "She's got something special," he said. "The dogs trust her right away." Thomas smirked. "Maybe it's because she doesn't carry all that soldier silence around like we do." Luke chuckled softly, then looked out over the property. The fields stretched down the valley toward Cold Creek, where roofs now gleamed with new paint. Martha Jenkins had told them the town hadn't felt this alive in years. After the fire, people started coming by, some bringing supplies, others just stopping to talk. Somewhere along the way, the valley found its voice again. Right on cue, a familiar blue pickup rolled up the gravel road. The words, "Martha's Cafe," were stenciled on the side door. Martha herself climbed out, carrying 2 pie tins wrapped in kitchen towels. She looked much the same, tall and graceful, her silver-streaked auburn hair now tied with a red ribbon. Her coat was dusted with flour, and her cheeks glowed with the crisp morning air. "Morning, gentlemen," she called. "I come bearing reinforcements." Thomas smiled warmly. "If that's apple pie, I'll trade you 2 bags of dog chow for it." "Make it 3, she replied, handing him a tin. "And maybe next week I'll bring something for your volunteers, instead of just you 2. Elena appeared from the yard, wiping her hands on her jeans. "You're a saint, Mrs. Jenkins," she said. Martha laughed. "Flattery'll get you extra slices, dear." Inside the cabin, the smell of pie soon mingled with the rich scent of coffee and pine wood. They sat together at the table, the same one where Luke had once stared into silence a year ago. Now it was covered in maps, schedules, and a list of donations from townspeople. Martha pulled a folded letter from her coat pocket. "Got something for you," she said, sliding it toward Thomas. "Town council approved your registration. Echo Shelter's official now." Thomas stared at the paper, a slow smile spreading beneath his beard. "Well, I'll be damned," he said softly. "Didn't think bureaucracy would ever do me a favor?" Luke looked at the seal on the page, his chest swelling with quiet pride. "We did it," he murmured. "No," Martha corrected gently. "You built it. And now Cold Creek's behind you. Folks are donating lumber, feed, even old kennels from the county pound. You'd be surprised how many people needed this place without even knowing it." For a moment, the room fell silent, except for the soft ticking of the old clock on the wall. Outside, the dogs barked and chased each other in the sun, their shadows dancing on the thawing earth. Later that afternoon, Luke and Thomas walked along the fence line, inspecting repairs where winter had taken its toll. The snow had retreated to the high slopes, replaced by muddy grass and wildflowers beginning to bloom. The air smelled alive again. Thomas leaned on the post, looking toward the mountains. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked. Luke shook his head. "Not anymore. There's work to do here, real work." Thomas smiled faintly. "Your brother would have liked this place. He'd have seen what you're doing and called it redemption." Luke looked down at Echo and Scout, sitting at his boots. "Maybe it's just peace," he said. "Something I didn't know I was still fighting for." A breeze drifted through the trees, carrying the faint scent of pine sap and spring rain. In the distance, they could see Martha's truck disappearing down the road, her laughter echoing faintly in the valley. The volunteers had gathered the dogs for their evening run. Elena blew a short whistle, and the entire yard erupted in joyful chaos. Paws pounding, tails whipping, barks rising into the clear air. Luke leaned against the fence, watching Scout chase a stick, while Echo herded the younger dogs in circles like a proud guardian. Thomas stood beside him, eyes soft with memory. "You know," he said quietly, "the day I stopped my truck on that snowy road, I thought I was just helping a stranger. Didn't know that stranger would end up saving me." Luke glanced at him, smiling. Guess the road had other plans. Thomas nodded. Maybe that's what faith really is. Keeping your hands on the wheel, even when you can't see the path. The wind shifted, warm and gentle, carrying the scent of earth and rain. Above them, the flag at Echo Shelter fluttered against a sky that glowed gold with evening light. Luke watched the dogs running free, the laughter of volunteers, the sound of life thriving where silence once ruled. Spring came back, he said softly. Thomas smiled, his eyes on the horizon. Yeah, he murmured, and maybe this time it's here to stay. The wind moved through the trees like a sigh of relief, and from the field came a chorus of barking, strong, alive, and endless, echoing through the valley like a promise that the long winter had finally passed. Sometimes, what feels like coincidence is something greater, something sacred, moving quietly beneath the surface of our ordinary days. Maybe it wasn't luck that made Thomas stop his truck that night, or chance that guided Luke down the same frozen road. Maybe it was grace, the kind that doesn't arrive with thunder or miracles, but in small acts of courage, in the hands that reach out when the world feels cold. Echo Shelter wasn't just built from wood and wire. It was built from faith. Faith that broken things can still be made whole, that compassion can bridge what war and loss once divided. And perhaps in every rescued dog, every soldier who finds peace again, there's a whisper of God's reminder. No soul is ever truly lost, only waiting to be found. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who still believes in second chances. Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe so these stories of hope and faith can reach more hearts. And tonight, when you bow your head, may you say a prayer for the soldiers still searching for home, for the animals who remind us of loyalty, and for all who walk roads where faith feels far away. May God bless you and keep your heart warm through every winter ahead.